Welcome to the Surfcast Podcast, your weekly source for surf fishing discussions, tactics, interviews, news, and more. The Surfcast Podcast is hosted by Jerry Audet and Toby Lapinski, two of the most dedicated and obsessed surf fishermen that you will ever meet. The tide is up, the wind is at our back, so let's hit the surf. Yeah, so I'm always nervous about my background when we do these. As you can see behind me is my rod building bench, which is set up all the time. And I mean, Matt, I know you were building rods. What's going on with it? I know we've talked about it when I was at the Fisherman still. Are you building now? Are you still kind of on break? What's going on with that?
Yeah, so actually I built rods for years before I even got with the Fisherman Magazine. I was taught, I would say I started 10 years ago. I started doing it. It was a lot of surf rods, a lot of surf stuff, because that was pretty much my my specialty. I don't do some inshore stuff too, some boat rods, so on and so forth. But when I got away from that, I got into the fisherman. I kind of got away from the whole rod building thing, and it's one of those things I actually have picked up again recently, which it feels good to get back into it, because when you put something down for a while and then you did enjoy it and you pick it up again, it's like a whole. It feels like refreshed in a way, and I'm really enjoying that. I've been doing some light inshore stuff. Some surf rods for some friends and stuff like that. I did a couple rods myself. We've been actually doing some stuff with the fishermen. We've been working with a couple companies to do some upcoming articles on rod building. So that's been keeping me kind of busy. Building some Century stuff too as well. I haven't played with the Century stuff before, but I got to hit my hands on their blanks, and I have to say that I'm really impressed with the way that their stuff is power and sensitivity, and the way it just comes to a complete finished rod. So it's been good to get back into it, I have to admit.
Cool. Yeah, it's funny. I learned to first build rods. I mean, no exaggeration, I was in middle school. I had a couple hunks of wood that my dad and I cut, the old school V's, set up on the table. And I mean, now I've got a Clemens lathe, powered the whole deal. So it's funny how at times it comes and goes with me too, and I'll get back into it.
So it's funny you say that, Toby, because of course I have a regular bench. It's an American tackle, and that's with the slider and everything, and the thread carriage, and it's all, aluminum, and it's great. But the funny thing is when I originally started rod building, it was on a homemade bench with C clamps, and the rollers and the bearings on the supports for the rods were from the 50s, from an airport. They were airport pulleys or something like that, and they were built from years ago. Again, I'm talking 60, 70, 60 years ago. These things were built, and they roll just as good as any of the ones that do nowadays. And for some reason, I'm just more comfortable. I went back to it again. I'm more comfortable using this homemade bench from the 50s with these giant rollers that were, I guess, from an airport, airplanes or something like that, pulleys. And I don't know, I'm just comfortable with it. So it's funny that I did go back to the original way I was building rods. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's a good connection actually right there to the subject that we're going to talk about today, in that, something we used to getting back to something we used to do, something not doing all the time, getting back into what have you. And that's fishing the outflows. Cause for me, fishing the outflows was something I did when I was younger. I got away from it. I come and go. I know you do it a lot today. So I'd like to officially introduce and kick off this episode of the Surfcast Podcast. We have special guest Matt Broderick. Matt works at the Fisherman Magazine. He's the editor of the Long Island edition. I've known Matt quite a few years now, since before he joined the Fisherman. I think, if I recall, the first time I think we met in person, wasn't it on the Spro trip that we did?
Yeah, Shinnecock Inlet fishing the outflow. So yeah. Now it comes full circle.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the first trip we did fish the outflow, we fished the party boat. So a couple of surf rats getting together, and that's where it all comes from. But thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking your time, the busy show schedule that you got. I know you've been at the New York Boat Show yesterday before we record this. So thank you again.
Yep. No, definitely. It's been busy, and I'm going tomorrow too. So, that time of the year, the shows and events, it's almost every weekend.
Better you than me these days.
Yeah, well, I enjoy meeting the people still. It's, I still really like it. It is, I guess, it does get tiring, with the weekends and stuff like that, but it is all part of it, and love meeting the people and the readers, and hearing what they have to say.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump right into things here. Got a few questions lined up for you. A couple we let you know about. A couple we might hit you with to surprise you. We'll see how it goes. But let's start off with the simplest, straightforward question. Why should someone even bother fishing an outflow? I mean, they're difficult if you've never done it. At times they can be crowded. A lot of people consider it not real surf casting. So as someone who does it a fair amount, pretty good at it, what do you how do you feel about that? Well, why should
I mean,
someone fish an outflow?
so the first thing I'll say is like, you mentioned it may not be real surf casting. I would totally consider fishing an inlet like just as much surf casting as anywhere else. Whether you're fishing the beach or a back bay or something. In my mind, it's all surf casting. I wouldn't say fishing an outflow is any less. And probably one of the main reasons why I would say do definitely get on the outflows if you can is it has the potential to be one of the most productive spots, over a beach, over a rocky boulder field, over a back bay than anything else. I mean, think about the amount of water that's going in and out of a back bay or a bay, or coming from the ocean in a single tide in that outflow. The amount of bait, the amount of movement of everything, fish, bait, whatever it may be. It's a staging point as well. So if there's going to be a large bait movement, in a single tide, it sets up the perfect scenario for you to really be productive in catching stripers or bluefish or whatever you're going for.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So Matt, I mean, I want to go back to this idea that, real surf, not real surf, because I agree with you. I agree with you, and I'm not an outflow inlet kind of guy. But why do you think that people might say that? Why do you think? Because I've heard it a lot. I mean, I've heard people say the canal's not surf fishing and this not surf fishing. Why do you think people would say that about an outflow?
I think it's more getting too technical with the term surf fishing. So like when you say the surf, it's almost like the open beach, the waves, the surf, all that. And that I guess if you're being really technical about it, yeah, it makes sense to say, this is surf fishing, sand beach, whatever it may be. You would associate that with the term surf fishing. But when I say, for me, how I interpret the term surf fishing is you're on the land, you're on the shore. I would even consider fishing, off a dock, almost surf casting in some situation. And that's, maybe I might be a little biased about it because I like dock fishing sometimes. I've done pretty good off the docks. But I think that if your feet are planted on land, it is a form of surf casting. Whether you want to be technical about it or not, if you want to call it shorebound fishing or however you want to go about it, in my mind, surf casting is when your feet are planted on the land and not on a boat.
So I think that there's this connotation, maybe, from some people, not me, certainly not me. I don't want to make it sound like it is me, in fact, because it's definitely not. There's this sort of connotation that outflow jetty fishing is not very technical and that it's sort of not as smart fishing or something. How do you feel about that?
I would totally 100% disagree with that. There's a lot of things that go into consideration before approaching an outflow to fish. I mean, there's been times where I'll put it this way. I'll show up for a 45-minute window of tide, because I know those fish are set up perfectly. When it slows down, the currents are ripping too fast, I can present that proper sized jig right into that rip. Typically, the bigger fish are coming out that last, period of the tide when it slows down. It's very technical, and there's a lot of factors to take into consideration from, how fast the tide is running. The wind may influence the tide. There's a lot of different, the way the rip sets up on an outgoing versus an incoming tide. It's not just show up and catch fish, although you could, and that's with anything. I could show up right now, to any spot and catch fish by luck or chance. But when you narrow it down to being technical about it and learning these windows and what is most productive on this said tide or that said tide, your success rate when fishing an outflow will go up astronomically.
That's a good point of the approach. It actually leads into a question I had for you on sort of expanding on it. When you first get to the shore, you're going to fish an outflow, whichever one it might be. Do you walk up, where you're going because it's this time of the year, clock, tide, etc.? Or do you get there and give it a minute, observe, and see if things are where you thought they were? What are those first couple of steps before you take the first cast? Are you just a rundown, go, you know it, or you're taking things in to sort of analyze it a bit before you actually make that cast?
So there's a couple things I would take in consideration when it comes to fishing an outflow. And what you said, it's a little bit of both. There is the part of just observing, because sometimes you could see how the rip is set up, and if the rip is on top of itself in certain situations, it's running too hard. I'm throwing 5-6 ounces. I'm killing myself. I can tell by how the rip looks that it's going to be a nightmare to fish. We've thrown heavy lead all day. But if I can sometimes see the way the water's moving, the way that the rips is set up, that I may be throwing less, more a lighter weight, like 2.5 or something like that. That would be an example of the visuals. Sometimes I could show up because I looked at the tides. I know the window. I know how the tide may be at a certain point in the tide, how it may be moving, for example. And I can just show up and start fishing and be successful as well. It's a combination of both. And I would say you have to do the one that I just said, just showing up, got to be familiar with the spot. It's like, you got to fish the spot many times before to know how that spot is going to set up. If it's your first time, you've never been there before, and you are learning it, sit back, observe, see how the things are moving, see where the current breaks are, see where the drop-offs are. You can always tell by observing the surface of the water, what's going on underneath the water.
No, that actually, this kind of popped in my head. A lot of guys talk about, let's say, scouting a location. They go during the day, they go during the off season, the open surf spots traditionally. Have you ever done that in the outflow? Spent essentially non-fishing time observing and trying to better learn a particular outflow?
It's funny because a lot of my initial fishing that I like when I really started learning was after dark. So I guess I kind of did it backwards, but at the same time, me doing it at the more least, like the less ideal time to learn by, seeing the water, I guess it made me a little better at it over time. I'm saying, like I was thrown into the fire. I used to fish with this guy back, years ago, and he'd be like, "Oh, we're going to fish the outflow. We're going to fish the inlet." I'd be like, "Okay," and it'd be the middle of the night in the inlet. He knows exactly what he's doing. I'd show up and he'd be like, "No, you're doing it all wrong. You're casting here, this, that, the other thing." I'd be like, "It's dark. I can't see anything." And then he'd be like, "No, you have to cast there. Let it swing. Let it drop. This, that." And I guess from me just being thrown into the fire of like probably the worst possible time to learn how to fish an outflow, I learned it a lot quicker than just showing up and during the day and observing things and not fishing it. Not to say that that's not a bad idea. I would probably recommend that for most people, to go and do it the right way as opposed to the reckless way. But the way I learned was getting thrown in with the wolves and getting thrown in with a lineup of guys who were experienced and knew what they were doing. So
that's interesting. I think that that's something that's sort of almost missing from a lot of new anglers. They want to like already know how to fish. They want to get everything like ahead of time, so then they show up, there's no learning curve. They don't want to fail. And I think that being thrown into the fire like that for anything, not just surf fishing, but it can be really important. And doesn't it also, this is a question, not an assumption, doesn't it also make it feel more satisfying when you have to fail a bunch and then you succeed?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
The self-satisfaction, like the satisfaction I got out of like actually being successful. Because I'll put it this way. In the beginning, he outfished me, my buddy, like 15-1. And he's like, I'm like, "What are you doing?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm just letting it sink and, going popping behind the rocks and stuff." I'm like, "What are you even talking about? How do you even know the rocks? Like, it's dark out." He goes, "Oh, you just have to like pop it up and stuff." And I'm like, "That's crazy, man. Like, how do you know that?" And then I guess eventually it all kind of clicked. And then you get that initial, the thump, that's the best thing, the bucktail. And I'm like, "Oh," and of course, as you do it more and more, you get more of those thumps and you're like, "Hey, maybe I'm doing something right now. I'm letting enough line off the reel. I'm getting that bucktail down into that sweet spot. I'm using the right weight. I'm letting it swing enough." So as you do it more and more, of course, you become more successful. And it is a very rewarding feeling. And it is just getting that hit in those inlets. It's awesome in itself.
Yes.
It really is. Yeah, they slam it.
Yeah, they definitely do. So you said something I want to follow up on, and we're probably jumping too far ahead too early because this is a pretty seriously technical question. But I think a lot of anglers, this is at least my maybe naive opinion. A lot of anglers will come down to an outflow, something like this, and they'll either walk to the tip of the jetty and they'll just start casting straight out, or they've heard that they should swing a bucktail and they'll throw it in the water and they'll just swing it and they'll swing it and they'll swing it and swing it. It sounds like you are picking apart all kinds of little other extra pieces. You already said, like, oh, there's the seam, and oh, that's the rip, and popping it over rocks and stuff. That the outflow isn't just this sort of singular piece of water that's flowing out. Is that right? So you're like spots
100%.
within spots, and you're picking them apart. Is that right?
100%, 100%. So there's at certain parts of the tide, the different parts of an outflow set up differently, whether it's the incoming or the outgoing tide, whether you're in the middle of an inlet or a jetty, the backside, the tip even. The tip could be, a great place to work a bucktail as well. Different, and that's part of it is learning it. What parts of the tide set up best at certain parts of the inlet, and that's all about putting your time in. Of course, you don't learn that from just showing up one day for a couple hours, and you might discover something, but it might be a little piece of the puzzle. It's
so let me jump in there because you said something that I find interesting as someone who's, again, maybe not as skilled in this as you two are. Bucktailing from the tip. Now, my assumption, and clearly this is me just being dumb, that's not something I would always. I don't know if I would reach for a bucktail at the tip of the outflow. That's not the first thing I would do. So what do you mean by that? How do you bucktail the tip? Like, how you approach that?
Now, when you say like you wouldn't reach for a bucktail, would you reach like a swimming plug more or like is that?
I mean, again, your inlets are very different potentially than some of our inlets where we are. But even that being said, I probably would be using some form of darter or back swimming something or casting.
So I'm not going to disagree with you on that either, because I've had times where, for example, on an outgoing tide, there's sometimes an outer bar in front of like the tip of a jetty, because that's how the shoaling sets, especially even by me. I don't know how it sets up by you specifically, but there's shoaling that occurs. And on an outgoing tide, sometimes those stripers will set up on an outgoing bar, and floating a darter or like a bottle plug or like something that floats so you could float out there is one way to get to them. That is a very successful technique you could use when fishing the tip of an inlet. There is other situations, for example, that swinging a bucktail, on an incoming tide or an outgoing tide, could be very could work very well if those fish are tight to the jetty and posting up between some sort of break in the current or structure. So they're both like situations, like whether you're fishing a swimming plug or a jig, darter or like a salt plastic, for example, could work in either situation. It just depends on your specific inlet, and it goes back to learning your specific inlet as well.
So at the tip, are you still swinging the bucktail, or are you casting it out and retrieving it?
I've done both.
Okay.
I've done both. So there's been times where it'll set up on certain tides, so where you could swing it across like the tip of a jetty, and those fish will be setting up waiting for it. And then there's times where you could just cast it out, let it sink down, and slowly retrieve it, and you'll catch fish also. If they're more feeding on like active bait running around, the cast and retrieve method works a little better. If they're staging, I guess, waiting for bait to come by, and they're staging in like a rip or something like that, the cast and swing method works a little more efficiently.
Interesting. That's so it's not a seasonal thing then, the swinging versus the retrieving, or is it? Or is it a bit like, again, this gets back to the idea, do you pattern? You're like, okay, on this moon, the mullet are coming out or the peanuts are coming out. And so I know I'm going to be focusing more on, and again, this could be completely wrong. So this is just an example. I'm going to be more focused on, throwing it out and retrieving it. Or is it like you show up and you're like, oh, the fish are breaking, or, a few casts in, you're like, wow, they're being really aggressive. They must be chasing. Like how do you make that determination?
So again, both like techniques could work at both times, either whether it's like the fall or it's the the spring, whatever it is. But what I've come to realize with the fall versus the spring is they seem to stage more. And this is just where I am. I don't, again, every spot is specific to everybody, but the fish seem to stage a little more in the spring as compared to the fall. Maybe that's because there may be less bait in the spring and they're just picking away in the spring in the certain spots. In the fall, you have the menhaden in the bunker that move in, or if it's peanut butter, whatever it is, or what's the other one? The mullet, the finger mullet. They seem to be more like just masses coming through. And when that's when you would cast down and retrieve kind of if they're just moseying around at like the tip of a jetty or something like that. But I have noticed that in the spring, it seems to be more of like a stage bite. And that's more of like a technical swing the bucktail kind of bite and this is just where, places that I fish and I've experienced. It might be like that by you too, but just my observations.
Now you're referencing their spring versus the fall. Are the outflows for you something that you only fish early season, late season? Is it something that you're considering that's part of your day-to-day stops throughout the season, through the summer? I mean, I know, especially, where I'm fishing a lot of the southern New England, guys don't really look to the outflows in the summer for whatever reason. I won't get into whether that's right or wrong, but it's sort of, as a whole, people look at it, it's not quite where you want to go. You fish at spring, you fish at fall. What do you find? Like, do you agree with that? Are you different?
Personally, I like to focus, like when I'm fishing inlets, for some reason, I guess it's just the way I trained myself is I fish them in the spring and the fall and they're very productive. Maybe it's because during the summer months I do other kinds of fishing, like I'll do fluke and stuff like that, and I'll do whatever, sea bass, porgy, everything else. So maybe I don't put as much effort into just sitting at the inlet and fishing like an inlet with the same amount of time that I'll fish it during the spring or the fall. That being said, I know guys who will sit there all summer, like after dark, of course, is always a better time during the summer months where it cools down and things are quiet. But they'll pick bass all summer, and when I say pick bass, I mean like fish into like the 40-pound class. Probably not as hot and heavy as they would in like the spring or the fall, but they certainly, and I know confirmed that guys will go to the inlet throughout the summer months. But when I say summer months, I say August. The heat of the summer. And they'll catch fish, nice fish. And the reason why, I guess, is because it's the best body of moving water, that time, for that time of the year. It's the coolest water, ocean water coming in, bay water coming out. It's that air, oxygenated water. It's the highest quality of water during that season. And again, there's a lot of bait. The fish are always going to be there. So yeah, it is productive during the summer months as well, speaking to other anglers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely found that summer, like a late night incoming, you get that cooler water. I mean, sometimes you can almost feel when you get to the water when it's mid-time. A lot of that cool water has been coming in. It almost feels like this is right for the summer, even though it's looked at again. So where I'm thinking about as you don't fish them in that time frame. So
yeah, I mean, there's other spots that are very productive too. So I'm sure those are. Other spots to focus on. Like, go to Montauk during the summer, you can always do pretty good. Our entire North Shore over here on the island, you can always, pick some fish in the summer. It's cool, deep water. But again, the South Shore inlets over by me, you do have a shot at being productive at certain times during the summer months as well. If you want to put your time in, of course, it's all about the time.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So you also just said something that really piqued my interest. Are you primarily chasing incoming, outgoing current? We'll say we'll avoid the word tide. Incoming, outgoing current based on temperature, or do you focus on both certain times? This is like a 3-part question, so if you need me to remind you, I will. The final part of that is, do you fish through switches, which is something else I'm curious about based on what you just said.
So there's, of course, things that I've learned, how like an incoming or an out. So I'll break it down this way.
Okay.
During the spring months, I've had success on both tides, incoming versus outgoing. I guess I've noticed maybe that I kind of like the incoming sometimes, like in the beginning of the spring, because you have like all that bait like showing up coming in from the ocean and this is just in my mind, and I guess I've caught enough fish on this tide to justify it, but it seems like on the incoming tides, there's like bait coming in from the ocean, it's coming into the bays, the bays are coming into life and stuff like that. And that incoming tide with that influx of bait, there's only one way in and one way out. They're coming in through that outflow. They come right in, and there's fish waiting for them. And don't get me wrong, I've had a lot of luck on the outgoing too. But for that's one of my philosophies, I guess, in my mind, as to why an incoming tide makes sense during that earlier portion of the year. And then the opposite for the fall months, my mindset is like, oh, there's so much bait in the bay. They're waiting for that low pressure system to all boogie out of there. And, that outgoing tide is going to be, dynamite. These fish are going to be waiting for that bait to come out of the bays. They're going to be setting up in those rips. So it kind of, but I've done good on the incoming in the fall too. So it's like, you think one thing, you think another thing, and sometimes it gets proven wrong. But I can confirm that. And well, from my experience, that incoming in the spring has been very good. Outgoing in the fall has been very good. And I've been wrong about that too, because it's been vice versa. But and what makes sense to me with the bait leaving in the fall and coming in the spring, I guess would make sense to a lot of other people as well.
If nothing else, I guess to surmise that part, there's no wrong tide to fish the outflows. If
you could fish dead slack too and do pretty good. Apparently, guys still eels at dead slack and they catch slobs sometimes. So I mean, it's like it's all about what you're. And I'll go back to this. It's like a comfort zone and like a what you're confident in. And if you can apply your time to something you're confident in and have learned about, then you're going to be better at it. And you're going to put more time in and you're going to catch more fish.
But if you can catch fish in the incoming or the outgoing, how the heck do you get started? Again, it goes along with do you fish through both tides? Do you just say, I'm going to fish every single night? Do you try to come up with a plan? And, how do you begin if it can fish on either? How do you get started?
It all goes back to putting time into learning in that specific spot. It's like one of these things that drives, and you guys know it because you guys surfcast. It drives our surfcasters crazy. They'll be like, "Oh, I've got it so figured out. I've got this thing dialed in." And then you'll be like, "Yeah," and then you'll show up on like the tide you think they're gonna bite on, and you're like, you get nothing. And then like your buddy was like, "Oh, I had him on the outgoing. I killed him all night. It was great." And I'm like, "What?" Like, "Oh, I didn't, I didn't think that could happen." And you're like, "Oh, I got to rethink my whole thing here." So yeah, that is a factor. But I'll put it this way: I've been consistently successful with what I've done and on those certain tides, and that goes back to being confident for me. And again, it's like confidence plugs too. There's a lot of plugs that work, but if you have that one plug that you're confident in, you're going to fish it a lot better. You're going to fish it a lot smarter. You're going to fish it until you catch fish sometimes. What it comes down to.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
Now you kind of touched upon this a little bit, but I want to specifically address this subject as far as how you're fishing the jigs in the water. When you start on a given night, do you start right out like I kind of define it like a slider, someone that casts and swings it through, a gorilla jig, or someone that's like putting a lot of extra life to the jig? Is there something between? Like, do you have a progression when you first start on a given night of I'm doing it this way the whole way, or I'm going to start this, see if it doesn't work and go to that, or is there something else? How do you kind of handle that side of presenting your jigs to the fish?
Yeah. So when you fish an outflow, like you said, it's about that swing. You get that moving current. You want to swing that jig. There's guys that I know that fish, they don't even impart any action at all on the jig. They let that thing swing without even moving. And if it passes in front of the fish's face, and they hit it. There's guys that I know, like one of my mentors that told me how to fish the inlet. He would do these crazy, all back snapping motions. And I'd be like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, they love this. They love this." And he caught fish, so that worked too. But at the same time, I have to say that there's been nights where this subtle, non-jigging approach has worked as well. The one thing I could say is if you do want to keep that jig down in the strike zone, and you're doing those aggressive snaps, you have to remember that when you do that, it's going to take more for that jig to get back into that strike zone. So do take that into consideration when you do fish an outflow, is when you do impart that crazy action, it's going to, you know, you're not gonna be in touch with that bottom. You may be out of the strike zone for a longer period of time. When you do that subtle just swing, the jig is going to stay true, it's going to stay consistent, and when it hits that maybe potential drop off, it's going to fall right off that ledge where that fish might be sitting. But both work. You know, both work. You just have to play with it. They might want one thing on a certain night. They could want a totally other thing on another night. It's like eating, I don't want pizza every night. I want a steak one night. So, give me the steak, once in a while. You know what I'm saying?
Or
I
just
want
ice
pizza
cream for dinner.
I want pizza every night.
I could eat pizza every night too, to be honest.
So-
If I had to, if I could live off like one food, it might be pizza.
Yes.
But I would get sick of it. I would definitely get sick. I'd want the steak
toppings.
Yeah.
You could.
Yeah, you got pepperoni, you got the white clam. We're not going Hawaiian because that is not a pizza. I don't even want to start that debate.
How
Well, like,
dare you?
It's like getting the plain slice versus like the like the meatball slice, and the meatball slice would be imparting the action, and then the plain slice would be the regular swing. So I guess I'll look at it that way.
Yeah. So first of all, Toby and I'll have a fist fight off air because how dare you about Hawaiian pizza?
Oh, and then if you want to add like a trailer to your bucktail, it's like the mozzarella sticks or the garlic knots as well.
It's the flavor. Let me ask you though. So you said when you're doing the gorilla, what did you say, Toby? What is it? Gorilla?
I call it the gorilla jig. I heard the term thrown around in the canal years ago, and it's like,
I've seen the guys do it at the canal. They're like going like that. But I've done it at the canal too. I just let it swing and it worked as well. So I don't know what works. Whatever works or not better. I don't know. I call just as many fishing. Yeah.
Yeah. So
especially 5 ounces. It's like, oh, are you kidding me? Doing this at 5 ounces all night, and I got to burn it back in at the end. Oh, like that's a workout.
you don't want to hook a fish then.
No, I can't say that. I can't. I always want to hook a fish, but to a degree, maybe.
So that, I mean, I guess you've already answered my question, it sounds like already, but if you're snapping like that, is it a timing thing, or are you specifically picking a heavier jig because you're like, all right, I'm going to be imparting a lot of action, so I'm going to a heavier jig, or is it more just about your timing and understanding where you place the snapping and letting it fall?
So I've usually just gone with a slightly heavier jig so the thing, it can recover quicker. That's been my philosophy. So, if you're fishing like a 2 with like no action, maybe step up to like a 2.5 with the action so that thing can get down a slight bit quicker and you can, snap it up, whatever, and get back in the strike zone for when the fish are there. As far as like consistency goes with snapping, it's like just something I'll throw in like every 5 seconds or so. I mean, there's no handbook to this. There's no handbook whatsoever to this. It's more of like a let's go out there and see what they want tonight kind of thing, and sometimes they do want that aggressive snap. Sometimes I've done like a more subtle snap. Sometimes I just let it slide, and I've done very well all 3 ways.
Interesting. Yeah. So besides a jig, is there anything else you use? So it was
funny.
Besides a bucktail.
Yeah, it was
besides a
funny
bucktail jig.
Yeah, besides a bucktail jig.
For a while, it was funny because there was this like big you guys remember like the mega shad craze?
I avoided it, but yes, aware of it.
Like the crazy mega shad craze, and like everybody was like, at one point, like everybody was like using bucktails and like picking fish, and like I was like, oh, what are these crazy things? Like they're like these like crazy shad things that I picked up at some flea market or some guy gave me. And I had like the OG ones, like the ones that are like filled with salt and they smelled like that. What's that scent called? What's the thing that they're like filled with? Like it's like that anise.
The one that Bob the garbage man loves.
I don't know, whatever the heck. It's like that weird...
The anise.
Yeah, that stuff. Yeah, they reeked of that. They were like they're oily as like anything. And for a while, like at night, it was like kind of funny because like I would be fishing the bucktail, and I'd be like, kind of like going like back, like getting the mega shads out, like I'd flip them out there, and I could tell you, like, there's been nights where all these fish wanted, over a bucktail was the mega shad, and I get boom every time I get cast, boom again, and the guys are looking at you like, what the hell's this guy doing? What's he doing? And I got like switching like at night, like no lights on, and like that drives the guys crazy, man. I'm telling you, it would drive people crazy, But yeah, there was a while, and they're like, what do you use? I'm like, the mega shad. And like, what is that? I'm like, you can't find them anymore. Don't buy them. But yeah, there was a while, and it's of course it still stands true because they would still hit a mega shed where the mega sheds would outfish bucktails, and like it was like, oh, what's that secret bait like so and so is using or whatever, and you can get I was using the original one, so I don't know if I convinced myself. Again, it's like one of these weird surfcaster things is where you convince yourself like only one thing works. So it was like, oh, like I need the original ones. They have the right amount of salt in them. They smell just right for the bass because they love that so much. The thing's going by 100 miles an hour, but they're getting that smell. It's like one of those things like we convince ourselves, and like I was like, I gotta get the originals, and I bought like hundreds of them, and that's what I was using for like a long time. And of course, like probably like a Sluggo or like whatever any other identical soft plastic probably would work just as well. But us being surfcasters and like having this weird mentality of such like sometimes we'd be very narrow minded in what works. I was like buying like stock in Mega Shed like I was going to retire on or something.
Well, so that is the question though, right? And I think you're getting to something actually really important because I think I'm way more guilty of this than Toby. I think I'm way more guilty of this. I get stuck on stuff, but so I'm giving you credit, Toby. But you don't think? But my question is the mega shad you were obsessed with. But do you think you could have done the same thing with a bucktail and trailer? Do you think you could have accomplished it?
I don't. In certain scenarios, it was blatantly obvious that the guys fishing next to me with bucktails and trailers were catching less fish than I was with a mega shad.
So why?
Why? But the way it floated, you know what? I have to ask the stripers, and that's a question I really can't ask them. But I mean, it maybe because of the way that it floated in the column, the way it got down as in comparison to a bucktail, the profile. I can clearly say that there has been nights, and I'm not trying to like hype mega shed because in other scenarios, bucktails have outfished the mega sheds, but there has 100% been nights where if you did not have a mega shed, you were getting outfished 3 to 5, 5 to 1, whatever it was, and it's frustrating as hell because who wants to get outfished 5 to 1 doing the exact same thing as the guy next to you?
Yeah. That's funny.
But I wish I could justify better in my mind. And the justifications that I just put forward, I guess, are the ones that make the most sense between profile and the way that jig floated or whatever it may be in the column.
Is there anything else that you've used where you've had that experience in the outflow? Like, where you're like, oh man, this has worked really well or whatever?
Yeah. There's been times where we've been tossing gag shads that have done really good in comparison to the bucktails. Like tsunami shads have done really good in comparison to bucktails, and even the mega shads. And I could attribute that more to the paddle tail.
Right.
That giving off that vibration, a totally different action. It's something that the fish may pick up on a little better than just that bucktail running through. So that's more justifiable than that, just like that more subtle profile of like a bucktail or like a mega shad that just kind of skates by with it, limited action from the jig itself. So like a gag shad that has a big paddle tail, it's sending off that vibration. That makes more sense in my mind. And we have had nights where we've outfished the bucktail with like a gag shad. And of course, the canal, you guys see it. The guy, everybody's throwing like, some sort of Savage gear or gag shit. You can't even keep them on the shelves in half the places over there. And you got to have like the crazy wacky Macky pack, whatever it is, pattern or whatever. So that's always the thing too. But it definitely has been nights where that's done well. So it's weird. It's really weird, man. It'll drive you crazy sometimes.
Your bag ends up weighing 1,000 pounds because you got to put all the jigs in because you don't quite know which one it's going to be that night. It could be the paddle tail. It could be the bucktail. It could be the mega shad. It's packing a jetty bag can be I'm luckily there's certain spots by me where I can just pull the truck up and have like the whole thing behind me. But there are spots also where it's like I got to walk and I can't have access to it. So you're bringing 40 pounds of freaking lead with you out to like some spot. And you're like, what? You're like, damn, this sucks, man. There's one time I put my bag down, like a wave blasted it and all my stuff went all over the place. I'm like, you got me kidding me. My freaking hat like flew off. It was like my lucky hat. I lost that night. Jetties are crazy, man. They're like, and there's like a danger aspect to them. And actually it's weird because like
like, people typically don't want to be in like some like crazy dangerous situation. But I used to like live for that stuff, like that, like danger, like that a danger thrill aspect of it, like landing the fish, knowing where to go down on what rock and where I'm not gonna get blasted, into like the into some other rock kind of thing. And the whole like that was like an added part for me was the thrill and adrenaline rush of like fishing the jetty. Like that was cool in itself. And I kind of like you look back at it and you're like, damn, that was kind of crazy. Like,
I was kind of stupid.
No,
oh yeah, and I'll do it again though, but it's still it's
of course. Yeah, like, it was
all
funny.
part
Like
of it.
real quick, like I remember similar what you're saying when I was younger, something I would never do now. But I was fishing an approaching hurricane at an outflow, and the waves were so big crashing on. There was only me and one other clown bothered fishing, even though we were still banging fish. Every time the wave would crash, we would hold each other as if holding each other would give enough weight so the wave wouldn't take us away. It would crash through we mid retrieve, swing, stop, hold each other. The wave would crash, recede, we'd keep going. And I mean, afterwards, we got back up to our trucks and looked like, why the heck did we do that? But at the time, I was into that. Now, no.
Yeah, just one night, man, I was fishing like a jetty, like a tip of a jetty. Like they have like the towers on with the light and stuff like that. And like the tower would like block like the waves and like it was our protection. So we would take a cast into like the rip and like like real quick and like we timed the waves when they would come in. And like, we were like, oh, it's coming. Like we reel back in and run behind the tower and like, like be like, all right, let's brace ourselves. Like it was like so stupid. Like some of the things like we put ourselves, we used to do like ridiculous stuff, man. Like just like you're like, why did I do that? Like, why was I doing this for like probably not even again, the fish probably weren't even set up there. It was like probably dirty as anything. And I was like, what am I? It's just like but I don't know. It's like one of those things that we just got drawn to it to a degree.
So
crazy.
So that's an interesting question, actually. You're coming up on all these great memories. Is there a night in an inlet that you look back on and you're like, this was like one of the best nights ever? Like it may not even be catch rate, but maybe it is. But do you have like a favorite inlet memory, an outflow memory that you think about a lot?
I've had a lot of memories fishing the jetties because I did put a lot of time into it. So one night that specifically comes to mind was I've had a lot of nights, and this I didn't catch any huge fish this one night specifically, but it was like October, and it was like kind of like I don't want to say is before like people got like like really like on the jetties, like people started fishing the jetties like really like a lot like in numbers. But I remember it was like a stretch in October, and I'm talking like 8 years ago, like 9 years ago. Me and my old fishing partner, we went to the jetty, and like it was like an October moon or something, and we had fish every night of the week from Monday through Friday, every cast, and on a full moon, you could see you didn't even need your light from like 15 to like 25 pounds the entire tide, every cast for 5 days straight. And then the weekend came and it was like a bunch of guys there, but just ridiculous, like, fishing, like just consistent and just, like clockwork. And then, again, nothing was huge. We didn't catch anything over 25 pounds, in that stretch, but it was just a very, I just remember that, like, I was like, wow, like that was crazy. Like how it was like that, that we had that bite and not a soul. There was one guy there. There was one other guy there for every, for all 5 nights. And, and then of course the weekend came and, people came out and they didn't have to work or whatever the reason being. And it got packed out, but we enjoyed the hell out of it for those 5 nights. I'll tell you that, we really did all night.
That actually, go ahead.
I think the consistency of the outflow is one of the general appeals of it, right? I mean, that's a question for both of you. I'll ask you both. I mean, I think the outflow being a consistent resource versus some boulder field or sand beach that constantly changes, right? I mean, that is one of the draws.
There is 100%. It's a spot that you can bank on any given time, any given night, any given day that you have a shot to catch fish. On the sand beach, I'll put it this way, if I go to the sand beach in the middle of the summer, maybe I'll catch, like some like, some schoolies or something like that, some holdovers, you're cruising looking for sand fleas or whatever. But, going to an inlet, an outflow, whatever you may call it, there's always in my mind a shot that I could catch something, that I could be, successful in a night, and even over like a boulder field or something like that. I do have spots that I'm pretty confident in as far as like rock fields go and boulder fields, but the outflow is always like up here, like success in my mind.
It's like you're more, I know for me, it seems like you're kind of saying this similar, that like you have a higher expectation to at least catch something when you're going to the outflows. Like for me, if I'm fishing an open beach, rock or sand, I expect to catch something, but if I don't, I'm like not as surprised as if I went to an outflow and got skunked. Like they're just, in my mind, there are always some fish. It seems like it's not always true, but in those outflows. So that's definitely for me personally, a piece that falls in there.
Yeah, no, totally agree.
So in your story there that you just said, you actually made a point that I wanted to touch upon when you said it was a full moon night. I'll still fish the full moons on the outflows, but I don't like them. On average, I find it where I am. And granted, where my outflows are smaller, shallower than what you're seeing in your waters. But do you seem to do nearly as well on those brighter nights as you do a dark? More difference than you do in the open surf? Is it even worse on a bright night in the outflows comparatively to open surf, or do you not really find much of a difference?
So I would probably say overall, you have a better shot in the outflows on like a full moon in the open surf. But again, I've had great nights on the open surf on a full moon too. Like I think it was 3 years ago. It was the bright night. It was like daytime, and I had a bunch of fish, a couple fish in the, in the 40-pound class, a couple in the 30s, like not, and it was the brightest night ever. I didn't even need to open no lights, nothing. So yeah, on the open beach in shallow water, it's totally possible. I'm not saying anything is impossible, but I'd like to think that due to the fact that it is deeper water, and when I'm saying deeper, I mean 15 to 30 feet deep in some of the outflows, the light isn't penetrating the water column as severely, and the fish don't, they're not going to be as affected by that moonlight. Now with that being said, there are times where I will fish the full moon, but take into consideration, there are certain windows where moonrise and moonset come into play. So where you could fish the moon before the moon is even up on a full moon, and you still have darkness. And as soon as that moon comes up, the bite turns off. I've done a lot of, thinking and done a lot of research on this. Not like I've typed it up online or something, but, gathered personal thoughts on this. And that it's weird because it is like clockwork. The full moons could still be productive. The fish could still be there, but they're more inclined to bite before that moon comes above that horizon and lights up the night sky. It is totally dark before then. That moon is still in effect. The current and tides that it brings is still there because of its pull. It is there, but the light factor. I don't know if it's the light factor, or I can't really put I have to say it is the light factor, the change of it suddenly. But when it comes over the horizon, the bite shuts off like that.
Yeah. We've definitely both noticed that plenty of times all over the place, for sure.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting. It's like that. Now that you guys made that connection with me, it's, I'm sure other guys have had that correlation too, but to hear from you guys, it does make a lot of sense. It really does.
No, it definitely does. Well, thanks so much, Matt, for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. We want to encourage everybody to check out the Fisherman Magazine, subscribe. It's one of our local resources. You can get some great surf fishing content and fishing content of all kinds with the Fisherman that Matt writes and Matt helps manage. And also, if you're interested in, a rod being built, as Matt said, he's doing that again now too. And we hope to have you back again, Matt. So thank you so much. And thanks, Spring.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure talking to you. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. Appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast and find more episodes at surfcastpodcast.com. And be sure to check us out on social media at the Surfcast Podcast.